Well, okay, everyone. Thank you for coming back on time after 5 minutes. I want to just say thank you for Nicole Powers, a graduate of our Grazia School of Business, to come back and share her experience with you tonight. Her name is Nicole Powers, and she's been in commercial real estate for many years. And it's an honor and a privilege for us to welcome her into our classroom, and it's really lucky for you that she decided to share her time with you. So let's give her a big clap.
Thank you.
And then she's gonna share her presentation and kind of tell us about her background and just a slice of information from the industry that she knows very well about. So I'm going to So I'm gonna, allow Nicole to start. So welcome, Nicole.
Okay. Hi, thank you guys for having me. So I should share my screen now, right? Is that correct? Okay, I will.
Yeah.
Okay. So Professor Park was really kind to let me come and talk to you guys today. And he asked me to speak a little bit about capital stack structuring for investment and development projects. So that's what I'll be speaking about today, and a little bit of the differences between multifamily, industrial, office, and hospitality development and investment types. So a little bit about me. I graduated from Pepperdine in 2015 with an MBA concentration in finance. I went to UT Austin undergrad, graduated 2009. I have 10 years of experience in commercial real estate and investment banking, covering self-storage, office, high-rise residential, multifamily, and hospitality in the US, and I spent a little bit of time in the UK as well. I've worked for Credit Suisse, which is an international investment bank, Harwood International, which is a commercial real estate developer who's based in Dallas and London, and for Strategic Storage Holdings, which is a self-storage real estate investment trust company with properties in the US and Canada. So I don't know how much y'all know about REITs, but REITs are basically operating companies that manage properties, and they have tax incentives for being set up that way. So I haven't covered that in this presentation, but if you guys want to, investigate it further, you can. So there's two different types of properties that Professor Park had me cover today, and one is investment and the other is development. So the way that you stack the capital for each of these types is a little bit different depending on what the properties are and the investment or development itself. So with investments, which is just an already standing property that you want to buy in order to get the cash flow from, and then sell at a later point in time and get the return from the increase in value. You typically will have a partner, and you'll set up an owning entity and a general partner and a limited partner. When you set that up, then you guys will work together to determine what your investment parameters are. So then you can locate the different types of properties that fit those parameters. And when you go and look at those properties to invest in, you look at typically what the market rent is for the property, the occupancy, the proximity it is to potential tenants or customers. And then you go and do an analysis, which is usually in the form of a DCF, or discounted cash flow, and you calculate what you want to offer the seller, but then you also perform an internal analysis to where you can add value, which would be to say if the property is only 80% occupied, that is what you would go to the seller with an offer price with. However, if you know that you can lease it up to 100%, that's an internal value add. And so you would know that that's actually a much higher value to the property than what it looks like right now. And then you would work with lenders to secure the debt, and then you would negotiate with the seller and close. So equity financing is the part of the investment structure where it is the cash portion typically. So you work together, and it can be either 100% of the purchase of the property, or it can be more like 30%. It depends on what the lenders are willing to do, depends on how stable the property is. If it's not very stable, if it's more risky, the lenders will require you to add more equity. But if it's a pretty stable property and there's a strong cash flow, you won't have to put as much of your own equity in to purchase the property. So when you purchase a property, you'll set up an entity that's going to be the owner of the property. So it won't be typically an actual person. And the reason you do that is because then that owner, the person, isn't actually liable for anything that goes wrong with the property. You set it up in its own separate little silo, pretty much, and it protects everyone involved. It also protects the owners from having anything of their own personal assets being taken in the case of a default on the loan. If the property for some reason isn't able to be cash flow positive, something like that, then the owners are protected. So you'll definitely have a general partner, a limited partner. Typically, the general partner has a 70% stake of the equity portion, and they are liable for the debts of the company. And then there's a limited partner that will take a smaller portion of the equity, but they're not liable for any of the debts. So the banks can't come after them for anything in the case of a default, but they have no decision-making abilities. So they're called the silent partner. So the general partner will make all the operation decisions and is usually responsible for leasing the property in any of the operations involved, security, insurance, like all of those things. And the limited partner is kind of just stands by and collects cash from the property. And typically the cash flows from the operations after all the expenses are paid, including the debt service. It's split typically how the equity is, so 70-30. So you can see on the right here where it says GP and LP 70-30. This is for the equity portion of the property. Now, when investors, the GPs and LPs, are looking for investment properties, they'll evaluate their own portfolios to see how they need to diversify it typically. So if they say they're heavily invested in like the stock market or bonds, and they want to do some alternative investments to diversify their portfolio, they would look into property to own. They also may look at their own personal assets that they have and see what the required divestiture timing might be to match up with some of their cash flow needs or large needs for cash. So when people do this, they usually look at their internal rate of return, the IRR. It is a little complicated to understand, but basically what they look at is their own cost of capital internally. So say if they needed to borrow money, they'll look at their weighted average cost of capital and want to make sure that any return from a property is higher than that, in order to make sure they're not losing any money on any investments. So they'll look at that, as well as looking at return on equity. Typically, most investors want at least a 2x or 2 times return on their equity when they invest in a project. So that would be when they divest of the property. They'd want to make sure that the equity part was at least 2 times of what they had put in. And usually investors will divest of a property between 5 to 7 years out. That's usually the horizon. It just depends, though. So like I said, they'll also look at the cash flow of the property and divestiture. The risk diversification, so say they may be already invested in properties, but they want a different geography. Maybe instead of just in the US, they want to look at the UK or Canada or elsewhere. And then property type, say they're heavily invested in offices, but they want to maybe look at hospitality or hotels as well, just to diversify and reduce the risk of their portfolios. And you also look at the cap rate of the property. And this is something that you'll find if you look on CoStar, which is a place that most people will look if they're looking for properties to invest in. They'll always have a cap rate, which is the net operating income of the property divided by the price. So the less risky the property, the lower the cap rate will be. So say it's like a really prime property, like central London, really nice, the cap rate may be 3%, which is really, really low. But say you're looking at something that's much more risky, that might be a hotel or, you know, maybe some self-storage, it could be, you know, 12 to 15% could be the cap rate. So that basically means you're putting in, you know, you're putting in more money for less of a return on your investment, the lower the cap rate is. But it's safer, so, you know, risk return. So some investment decision factors. So analysts, when they have decided what type of properties they're looking for and kind of the location, the owners will have an analyst go and look specifically at different properties. So if they're looking for multifamilies, they'll look for demographic information like typical family incomes for the area, employment rates and distance to workplaces, and current occupancy. For industrial, they'll look at occupancy rates, of course. It's always going to be a high factor on properties, obviously. The rental rates, so say what the rental rates are compared to the other competitors in the market, and see if there's room for increasing rents and things of that nature. Proximity to railroads or ports or highways for industrial is really important. For office, occupancy rates again, rental rates and lease terms such as expirations and renewals. If you have an office that has a lot of lease expirations coming up, that could be a good thing. That could be that you could get it for cheap and say that the rents that the office currently has are really low compared to the rest of the market. That could be a really good sign of a potential value add for that property. So you could get it for really cheap, release it up at higher rates, have higher cash flow, and it would just be a really great investment to make. And then for hospitality, hotels and restaurants, you want to look at nearby hotel occupancy rates, proximity to residential properties and offices, household incomes again. It's pretty highly important to look at occupancy, obviously. So for the offer price / the value add price, which is the internal one, this is where I was talking about, you look at the two different methods. You look at what their property currently is sitting, where its current occupancy is, what it currently looks like, and then you look at what you can do to the property and what you think you could truly make the property return, which could be in the form of either leasing it up to a higher occupancy rate, higher rents for the property. You could also do value add by say it's an office building and you could add maybe a restaurant or something to it. That would be a value add where you could generate further income by leasing the property out to maybe a restaurant or something of that nature, or any kind of retail for that matter. Or just maybe adding additional office space to the property that could increase income. So that would be an internal one that you would not go to the seller with, obviously. You would keep that internal. And the way you do it, as I discussed before, is through the discounted cash flow model. So you take the historical operating statements for the property, and then you forecast them out through an expected period of time, which is typically 5 to 7 years, ending with what the property would be valued at that point, in order to determine if it's a good investment or not. And if it's positive, then you would make the investment. If it's negative, then it would mean that you would lose money on the investment. So for debt financing, so then when you speak to lenders and when they determine how much to lend you, they'll look at the collateral of the entity and the creditworthiness from the financial statements and tax returns, and then some financial ratios, which include loan to value and the debt service coverage ratio. The loans are usually made to business entities. So like I had spoken about before, you'll create an entity that owns that property, but when the lenders are looking to lend money to you, they will look at the GP and LP's track record, which is their creditworthiness and their collateral and financial statements, to make sure that they have proven themselves and they're not a risk to lend to. So usually the entity that's formed will only own that one piece of property. And again, this is to protect the developer slash investor owners. So if it's, and usually it'll be within an LLC, but it can vary depending on what the goal is of the investor. But that means that the lender can't go after anything outside of that LLC if there's a default, which is really important because most people don't want to lose their homes or anything else if there's something that goes wrong. So when it's not guaranteed by, or when the lender doesn't require a guarantee, which is a personal guarantee, which means that someone is personally guaranteeing their own assets beyond the property, then it's called a non-recourse loan. And that's pretty typical. Mostly that is the case. And especially if you have a strong track record, you'll be able to get non-recourse. But if you're kind of just starting out, that might not be the case, unfortunately. So commercial real estate loans are typically 5 to 20 years long. And their amortization periods are longer with a balloon payment at the end. And this is usually because the commercial real estate owner will refinance at the end of the loan period. And so that balloon payment will be paid off typically by the new refinanced loan that the owner will get. And commercial real estate typically increases in value, so that's usually not a problem. And there's more than enough of the new financing to cover the old debt. So the loan to value ratio is how most lenders decide how much to lend to you, and it can vary from 65 to 75%, depending on the riskiness of the property. So say it's a office building that has really strong tenants, you know, that the tenants even have a really long, you know, operating timeline. They've been around forever. And the building's really leased up maybe to like 95%. You could probably get 75%, if not higher, loan to value. So that means that you would only have to put down 25% in equity. However, if it's not a very well leased up property, the lenders will think it's more risky, and so they'll require you to put more of your own skin in the game or more equity, and they'll only loan you up to 65% of the value of the property. So there's a simple explanation here. Say the property is valued at $1 million. The lender decides to lend you 75%, that's $750,000. So you would have to come up with the remaining portion for equity. So they also look at the debt service coverage, or the debt service coverage ratio. So this is the property's ability to cover debt from operations. And the formula they use is called the debt service coverage ratio. So it compares the annual net operating income to the annual net debt service. That includes the principal and interest. And they want to make sure it's typically over 1.25. And the more stable the cash flow of the property, the lower the requirement is. Again, this is all things that you negotiate with the lender with while looking at the properties that you're potentially going to purchase. And if you have a really good relationship with some lenders, this usually goes really smoothly and quickly. And obviously, the longer or more of a track record you have, the easier this becomes when working with them. So here's another simple example. Say the annual net operating income is $500,000. The annual debt service is, you know, $250,000. So the DSCR would be 2.0. It's above 1.25. So the lender will most likely say okay for this. So with debt financing, the interest rates are based on what the cost of the bank borrowing money is. So the bank, as you all know, has to borrow money, and they get charged a percentage when they do that. And so they have a margin placed on top of that that they charge to you to make sure that they make a profit and cover their operating costs, right? And typically what they'll do is match up a timeline with what the loan is for. So say it's a 10-year, you know, commercial real estate loan, they'll match it up with what a 10-year treasury note rate is, typically. And so banks also put in prepayment penalties because they want to protect their return, and their return is in the form of the interest that you pay them, right? So if you pay off the loan early, they miss out on all that interest that they could have made off of that loan. So in order to make sure that you don't do that, they will put in prepayment penalties, which may be as much as what the interest is that they were expected to make. It could be in other forms, but that would be typical. It's usually in the form of how much interest they would be expected to be paid. But the more you have relationships with banks, and if you refinance with that same bank, that might not be the case. You know, there's a lot of negotiation involved here, and things can be different depending on how well you know that lender. So you negotiate with the seller and close, and negotiations are usually 30 to 90 days long. Depends on the complexity of the property. So say it's a property that's an office building that's like the Chrysler building, for instance, has a ton of tenants, lots of leases. You have to review them. You have your lawyers, your team go through all the leases, see what's in them. That can take a really long time. But say it's an industrial building, simple structure, you know, it's a warehouse, maybe one tenant. That's a very, very simple closing process. And as you guys probably know, the expected starting point for negotiations is a price listed that the seller puts out there. And then usually it settles somewhere below that after inspections are made. There might be repair work, things of that nature. But if there's a large amount of interest, it's a really, you know, well-positioned property. There could be a bidding war, and it could be a lot higher than that. And that's where, when you work with a lender, they may require even more. You come up with that extra equity. They may only go up to what the appraised value is, and it could be much less than what the market value is because of the competition. So again, it just depends on your relationship with lenders. Very, very important. So typical financing structure or capital stack. So the equity portion would be GP's 70%, LP's 30% of the investment co, 30% equity. And the lender will say it's a, you know, 30-70 split between the lender and the investment co. That's how it would look. And again, the GP and LP, after the lender is paid the debt service and interest, they would receive the remaining portion of the cash flow, split 70-30 from the property. And then again, when the property is sold, they would split it 70-30 typically. There can be a lot more complicated investment structures, but the usual typical split is the 70-30 between the LP and GP. Okay, so that's how just standalone investment in a building that's already built is set up. Now, when you're developing a property, it can be different, but there is a lot that's still the same. So you do work with partners to secure equity and set up an owning entity. You'll have an owning entity, again, a GP and an LP. You'll determine the investment parameters. You'll locate a development site through like market rent analysis, occupancy, proximity. Again, it's very similar to the investment property type. You'll work with lenders to secure something called senior debt and mezzanine debt. So this is a little bit different with development properties, which I'll go into a little bit later. And then you also want to work with government entities about any economic development incentives. These are really important and can be a huge help when you're developing a property. Governments will want to incentivize developers to go into certain areas, and that's what these economic development incentives are. Then you'll purchase the development site if it's not already owned. Then you'll go into construction, and then there's post-construction financing. So again, this is the same for the most part as it is with an investment property. However, if a developer does own the land outright, sometimes with a lender you can contribute it as equity. So that means that the developer wouldn't have to come up with cash. They could contribute that land that they already owned outright as their equity for the development. They can also potentially contribute the fees that they would charge as a developer as their equity. So they would have sometimes almost no cash, actual cash out of their pocket in the game. And that's what they say, you always want to use other people's money, right, when you're doing developments or investments. So some of the fees that you can contribute as a developer would be, there's something called a development fee, which is 3 to 5% of the total construction cost. And construction costs are split in between soft costs and hard costs. So hard costs would be the actual, say, the beams or the mortar or bricks that you would be building the property with. And the soft costs would be development fees or an architectural fee or sale and marketing fees. Those would be soft costs. They're not things that you can actually touch. They're more like professional work fee types. So you can also contribute management leasing fees, which is 1 to 2% of gross revenue, sale and marketing fees. So say you're doing a high-rise residential, you can contribute some of the fees that you would charge for marketing and or the sale of the property of those units as your equity. Construction supervision fees, project acquisition fees, and architectural fees, which can vary a lot depending on the complexity of the project. So again, there's development parameters that investors will look at, and they look at the same things typically: internal rate of return, return on equity, the timing of that investor, risk diversification. And so when they're deciding to develop, they'll have an analyst again look at the different development property types. So for multifamily, you'll want to look at planning requirements or codes, government incentives, forecasted demographic information, incomes, employment rates, distance from workplaces, current occupancy for the competition in the area for multifamily. Industrial, it's the same as before: occupancy rates, rental rates, proximity to railroads, ports, and highways. Office is the same: occupancy, rental, lease terms, such as expirations and renewals. And hospitality, nearby hotel occupancy rates, proximity to residential properties and offices, incomes, and government incentives. So for the debt side on development properties, they'll usually have a senior debt, which will be kind of like what the investment property debt is. They'll have in that, and when it's called senior debt, the reason they call it that is because in the case of a default, they are the first to get paid out. So say the development project totally fails, the senior debt will have first priority over any kind of recoup of their money invested. And they'll usually do something between 60 to 70% of financing for development, maybe even less. It depends on how risky it is. And that's why there's something called mezzanine with development properties. So they will come in and fill that gap between what the senior debt has offered and the equity that is available. And like I said, senior debt is called so because of the event of a default, they'll be the first to get their funds back. And the mezzanine lender will be the second to recover their funds, and so they'll charge a much higher interest rate than a senior debt lender will. A senior debt lender will be like plus or minus 5%. A mezzanine lender will be 10 to 15%. And sometimes they have some very, I don't know if the right word, could be considered a little predatory. They could require in their financing that they can take control of the GP, which would be taking control of all the decision making in the development process if there's an event of a default. So they could take over the entire development if they work with the senior debt for pretty like a very small amount of money. So you have to be really careful when you're working with mezzanine lenders. And lenders typically, when you're going to make a development, this is the senior debt I'm speaking about now, they will usually require you to have an anchor tenant already signed and ready to lease the building. So before the building's even built, they'll require that you have someone who's an anchor tenant, which is usually someone that at least will rent or lease, excuse me, at least 20% of the building. So they're going to be the person that has like the sign on the outside, you know, of the building. When you drive by, you're like, oh, that's the Comerica building. So they would be the anchor tenant. They're not the only tenant in the building, but they're the one that leases most of the floors. That's the anchor tenant. So most lenders will require you to have at least 20 to 50% of the building pre-leased before they'll even decide to fund you for development. So government incentive, economic incentives. These are really, really great if it works for you and what you're looking for as a developer or investor. Of course, it's going to be in a more risky area. That's why they're incentivizing you to invest there. But they'll have things called something like tax increment financing, which are tax subsidies. So basically the development won't be required to pay taxes for a number of years, usually 20, and it will carry over to the new owner too. So say you develop the property and your plan is to develop it, lease it up, and then sell it once you developed it to someone else, that will carry over to the new owner. So that's another incentive that it's a big selling point, and lenders really are interested in that, because usually most governments don't want developments to fail that they're invested in pretty much. So it's really great because it involves even more people, and so the whole development is less likely to fail in general. So these are usually in urban renewal districts. Usually they'll want something that promotes or provides a bunch of jobs for the community. So for example, when I was working in Dallas, there was an incentive for hotel or hospitalities to be developed because they would provide a lot of jobs for the area. And there were a certain number of jobs that you had to create, and they had to be at least a 2-year long typical job period for an employee. And that contributed heavily to our ability to be able to get the development underway. So it's something to really look at when you're working on a development. So usually the development side is either purchased or is owned already. When you don't own it already, you want to look at the current zoning and planning requirements, because some areas will not allow certain types of properties to be built. So say it's zoned for, you know, residential, so you can't build an office there, you know? Those are really important things to look at. Sometimes when you do buy a property and it's already zoned one way, if you're planning on holding it for a long time, you can work with the city on changing what the zoning is for the property. That takes a really long time, and you have to have a very, very close relationship with the city. And you want one of those anyway, because even if the property is already zoned what you want to develop it for, you still have to submit permits and get other planning documents underway, and you have to meet certain project deadlines, or the project becomes delayed, and therefore the cost of the project increase, and you're really cutting into profit. And as I'll talk about in a second, how much you're able to get from the lender to continue to complete the project. And raw land usually requires a high amount of equity. It's usually about 20%. So during the construction period, the lender will make monthly installments to a developer to cover the cost of construction. And the amount depends on what has been budgeted. So again, if things get delayed, this increases the cost because you still have to pay your construction workers, you still have to pay the people in your office, all the overhead. So you really don't want anything to delay the project at all. The lender will require construction receipts to make sure that everything is in line and is costing what it should cost, you know, just to make sure everything's all good, you know. And usually this construction funding is for a 2-year period, but it can vary depending on how long the building takes to construct. You know, again, the less complex the building, the shorter the construction period will be. So once the building is completed, there'll be a refinancing, usually with permanent debt. So this will convert into more like what the investment property type is. The permanent debt is usually funded once the building's been stabilized. So that means the property's been completely leased up to like 90–95%, and there's a stable income stream. So usually when our developers are talking with tenants, in order to get them to lease into the new building, they'll give them some incentives such as free rent, or they'll have step-ups in rent. So once those have been completed or gone through, all those incentives, and the rent is actually stabilized, so the tenants are all paying the full rent amount, you can go to a lender and get the permanent financing. So therefore, all that construction debt is paid off through that new loan. So there you go. And so a little bit about the UK. It is different than how the US is set up, and these are just some little points, and I put some websites on here, so if you guys are interested in learning more, you can look at it. But the differences between the US and UK process, so debt is referred to as gearing there. It's a slang term that they use for it. Don't know why, but they do. So they also have a value added tax, which is called a VAT, which is 20% can be charged on the purchase price of commercial or mixed use properties. That adds quite a bit of cost to buying property in the UK. There are ways around that, but that's typical. They also have something called a stamp duty, which is charged in bands rising to a top rate of 5% on elements of the purchase price over £250,000 that the buyer usually has to pay. Now you can negotiate with the seller, and it depends on the property, but you can have them help cover some of that stamp duty costs. But it's again another addition to what the price of working in the UK or investing in the UK is. They also have really strict money laundering requirements. I put the website on there, or one of them, that you can look at and see what they are. But that's a really big issue in the UK. There's a lot of foreign investment there. And so they have some really strict rules that you just have to know them and stick to them, and it's all good. And then there's some ways that you can set up some non-UK entities in order to, possibly not have to pay some of the stamp duty taxes. But that can be really complicated. So again, if you want to look more into it, you can, but there is a difference mainly in the form of taxes that the UK requires you to pay. So that's it. That's all I got for today.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Thank you. And fantastic.
Thank
If
you.
you stop sharing the window, we're going to ask a few questions.
Okay.
Thank you once again. That's such a great snapshot
No
on
problem.
investment structures and kind of joint venture structure. So I have a few questions that I'm going to, that some of the students have sent to me. So let me see if I can get them in order. Let's see. Okay. One of the students asked, how do you feel about working in the real estate industry? Is it as stressful as jobs on Wall Street? And also, do you make any personal investments in real estate? And if you do, where do you, for your personal investment, what kind of data or news sources do you follow to make those types of personal investment in real estate decisions? So, yeah. So how does what's it like to work in real estate compared to banking? And is it good, bad, recommended or not? And then I guess do you personally invest?
I would say that it's great. It can be very similar to investment banking hours wise. It depends, especially if you're working for a developer. Sometimes it can be like some really intense periods when a property is being developed, and then it'll, slow down a little and be more of like a normal 9 to 5. But it's really exciting and it's really fun, and you learn a ton, and there's always something going on and something to do. So I would definitely recommend it to anybody. And no, I don't really do any personal real estate investing.
Great. Okay, thank you. Another person asked whether is there a, at least currently, any kind of prioritization between property types right now in terms of, I guess, measurements of success, or is it just different? So I guess certain types of real estate are preferred compared to other types of real estate, or do you think they are all sort of at equal level? It's just different types. What do you think?
Depends on how risk adverse you are. If you're like the type to jump out of planes, like go for a hospitality hotel, like that type is a lot more risky than an office per se, or like, a development. If you want to be a developer, like you're definitely the kind that's like skiing down a black diamond, versus a type that's a more passive investor in an already operating property. But the return is huge compared to the other. So again, risk return.
Okay. And another student asked, you said before, for I think the tax incremental financing, what kind of factors are used to consider I guess, riskiness, or what's considered risky, or I guess similar to sort of like opportunity zones, right? So I guess it's kind of, yeah, what makes certain areas more risky compared to other areas? I think that was the question.
Places that have a low employment rate are considered more risky. That have low income rates as well are considered more risky. There's different demographic information that you can find, like on the government websites, like the Census Bureau will have information like that. And then just working with and speaking with the actual local governments, they will already have places in mind that they want to provide urban renewal for. So if you just stay in close contact and development contacts like that with the city, it's huge. They will be able to help in a lot of ways with things like that.
Okay, I'll ask one question, and then I'll open it up for anyone else who might have questions. I think you mentioned finding a tenant or an anchor tenant before the lender is willing to give you a senior debt. So how does one go about finding a tenant before the development happens?
Well, you have to have a really good leasing department, or have really good contacts with, say, a leasing company like a Colliers or something like that. One of those real estate firms that do provide leasing services. It depends on how developed your own company is. If you're just starting out, you may not have the resources to have your own internal leasing department. So you may have to work with companies, real estate companies that do provide leasing, and you'll have to pay them for that. But if you have it internally, it's through making really, really good connections, again, with different companies, and you might know them and target them and have your leasing department become really, really, close with them. And or you'll have the company that you're paying, like a Colliers, say, or any other company of that sort, and know your targets, basically. And you can look that up by just doing some research online and seeing what companies have either moved in, or might be some big deals that just happen. And you just have to stay on top of it by reading the news, local news, and knowing there might be people that are, like, say, Google's moving in, to your city, and you want to get on top of that and talk to them. So typically an anchor tenant is someone that's like pretty well known, pretty established company.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to leave it open to for the students to ask a couple more questions. I really appreciate what she's done. Fantastic overview of structured and capital stack. So thank you so much for that. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Yeah, I'll regulate.
Hi, my name is Joe. I'm actually working as an intern in an investment bank, and we deal with some real estate, but most of our business is startups and energy companies. But I would like to learn more about some of the investment banking work that you did. Like, what did you do with Credit Suisse that, and I guess, influenced you to go into real estate?
So when I worked at Credit Suisse, it was as an intern. When I was at Pepperdine, I worked for them in the summer between the 2 years that I was there, and I was on the private wealth management side. So I worked on setting up portfolios for families that had different types of investment requirements that they were looking for based on their, say they had young children, so they want to pay for college or things like that, or they just had other things that they were really looking forward to doing, setting up, I don't know, trust, things like that. That's what I worked on. And so when I worked for Harvard International, they are like a family type office as well. So that's really what I've had experience in on the private wealth side for investment banking. Okay. But I did commercial real estate previous to doing investment banking. So
sounds interesting. Yeah, I definitely like to add you as a connection on LinkedIn.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so one more question. I think maybe I will ask one question on behalf of everyone, which is, it's hard to find women in commercial real estate often. I think just percentage-wise, there are not that many, and I want to encourage more women to go into commercial real estate. And maybe you can share a little bit about your experience of what that's like and opportunities perhaps going forward for our female students and just the industry as a whole.
Sure. I think finding a good mentor, someone that believes in you, is really important. I was lucky to find something like that. The people that I worked with in the companies were primarily male. However, they did have some females in some really top positions, which was really great. And, you know, it's always good to have role models like that to look up to. And it's a tough game. I mean, honestly, like, it's a lot of hours that you have to put in. It's similar to investment banking, which isn't, you know, if that's the kind of thing you're interested in, and if it's fun and exciting and it excites you, then it's not like you're working, you know. Just depends on how you feel about that and what you want your work-life balance to be. So
yeah, you might know they'll call you at 1 o'clock in the morning and tell you to have a sim ready for 10.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's the same way with commercial real estate. Yeah, but I mean, if you're okay with that, I mean, I'm someone that is okay with that. So you just have to be really, you know, all in, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
As they say, money never sleeps.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, that was just fantastic overview, given 48 minutes or 45 minutes or so. So I think I will, if you don't mind, I will I'll share the slides with the students. And then if you have any further questions, you can ask me first. And if I can answer them, that's good. If I can't answer them, if I have any other additional questions, then I will somehow forward it to Nicole to answer you. But otherwise, it's just so fantastic to have one of our alums to come in and give us a lecture. And so let's give her a big round of applause and say thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So, and I will keep in touch so that we can figure out some of the other stuff that we can do together.
Sounds good. And I just want to say Professor Park is awesome. I had him when I was in school. You guys are really lucky to have him as a professor.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so I asked her to say that at the end, so.
No, he didn't. No, he didn't.
But,
it's the
all
truth.
right.
All
Okay.
right, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Okay, I will make the slides available for you to review, but basically those are some of the concepts that I think she did a really great job of summarizing them into sort of one presentation, and very informative. So thank you. Hopefully you'll review it. We will take a break and come back at 8 o'clock, and feel free to bring food if you haven't eaten. Okay? Thank you. Talk to you soon.